Hello, everyone. My name is Tracy Peterson, and I manage the Holocaust and the United Nations Outreach Program. The program was established in 2005 by the member states of the United Nations to mobilize civil society for Holocaust remembrance and education in order to try and prevent future genocides. Today, we consider a pivotal moment in the history of the Holocaust in a lecture entitled The November Pogrom, a violent rupture to the sense of home and belonging. The November Pogrom refers to the state-sponsored and statewide terror campaign unleashed against Jewish people, their places of worship, and businesses across Germany and its occupied territory. The pogrom took place from the 9th to the 10th of November in 1938. The waves of brutal attacks against people, their homes, their places of worship, ruptured the sense of belonging that may have endured the preceding years of the Nazi government's legal discrimination. The events reverberated around the world and saw a dramatic rise in the number of Jewish refugees trying to find sanctuary beyond the reach of the Nazis. The November Pogrom is seen as the turning point in the radicalization of Nazi antisemitism and a harbinger of greater violence to follow. The pogrom culminated on the 10th of November, when 30,000 Jewish men were swept out of their homes and forcibly transported to concentration camps solely because they were Jewish. We are very pleased to have today renowned Holocaust historian and scholar, Professor Debórah Dwork, speak to us about the course of the pogrom through the lives of individual people, showing how public events shape private lives forever.
In memory of all those whose lives were shaped by the November Pogrom, or, as the Germans called it, the Kristallnacht, and the ever more violent actions against the Jews of Europe, I will tell the stories of a few. Through them, I seek to illustrate a key point. The November Pogrom was a pivotal moment. Europe twisted on its axis on November 9th and 10th. Victims, perpetrators, witnesses, helpers. We will see, too, how private lives and the public world are intimately connected. Public events would be of no significance if they did not affect the lives of individual people. And people's lives would not have been so sharply and violently shaped as they were had it not been for the sharp and violent events of the public realm. So let us begin with Robert Rosner and his family in Vienna, just before the Anschluss, the annexation of Austria by Germany in March 1938. The Rosner family was so poor in 1938 that they could not afford a radio. My father, my mother, and I don't know where my older sisters Erna and Paula were that night, went to a cafe to hear Austria's Chancellor Kurt von Schuschnigg's farewell address on a public loudspeaker. Faced with hostile invasion by Germany or craven acceptance of a Nazi government for Austria, Schuschnigg had chosen to resign. My father said immediately, "We'll have to leave." Perhaps, Robert surmised half a century later, his father was one of the very few Austrian Jews who decided on that very day that they were going to leave because he, the father, had come to Vienna from the Bukovina at the start of World War I, and his roots were not so deeply embedded in the capital city. Whatever the reason, his reaction was, "We'll have to leave. We won't be able to stay here. How can we get away with no money?" Impoverished, the family remained in Vienna, where civility vanished and antisemitic cruelty became mass sport. By the close of Robert's academic year in June, we were all talking about emigration and how we can get out, he remembered. My father found a cousin who lived in the United States on a chicken farm somewhere in New Jersey. He wrote to that cousin, and we went through telephone directories of New York looking for Rosners and wrote letters to all of them. At the same time, the family sought immigration papers from the American consulate in Vienna. My parents couldn't get on the quota because they were born in what was by then called Romania, he remembered. His eldest sister, Erna, in her final year of medical studies at the University of Vienna, got married in fall 1938. My brother-in-law Hans was Vienna-born, so he fell under the German quota, and there was room in the German quota. The Jewish community in Vienna, like the Jewish community in Germany, began to offer all manner of practical skills classes to help Jews' chances to emigrate. As Robert recalled, the Jewish community started a retraining scheme. First, I wanted to learn to be an electrician, but I wasn't accepted. Then, I got in as a chemist. I was always interested in chemistry. In Vienna, I started chemistry, learning to make shoe polish. That's about it. Immigration activities shaped Robert's life in unexpected ways. Jews stood online at embassies, consulates, shipping companies, and government offices desperate for papers, exit visas, transit visas, receipts for tax payments, clearance forms, ship tickets, train tickets. This gave young people an opportunity to make money. We kids did this work of queuing up, he remembered. One had to start at 8 in the morning, and one had to queue up until 11 or 12. So an adult would say, "Would you queue for me?" Sometimes they had to get a form, and then I could get it for them. But when it came to doing serious business, they had to be there. Robert's family, too, had to deal with all those papers, and his sister Paula took on the task of getting the family's tax clearance form, which they needed to obtain an exit visa. My father went bankrupt in 1928, so he hadn't paid all the taxes. Paula queued up, and as we had moved from the 8th District, where we'd lived in 1928, to the 2nd District, my father's name was not known to the officials in the 2nd District. Choosing not to check with the office across town, Robert said, the man who was there said, "Oh, hell, nothing is normal. Let's give the all clear that there are no tax debts." With the form the official gave Paula, they were able to obtain an exit visa. But where to go? Which country would let them in? We tried the Palestine office. We tried with family in Palestine. We were thinking, if the situation changed, if we could get to Romania. One uncle of mine tried to leave immediately for Romania, but he didn't succeed. He got sent back. One of my cousins went to Italy and one to Australia, and everyone said, "We'll try to help you." The November Pogrom swelled the number of Jews seeking asylum. The excuse for the infamous nationwide violence, which the Germans called Kristallnacht, or Crystal Night, or Night of Broken Glass, was the attempt by a young Jewish man, Herschel Greenspan, to assassinate Ernst vom Rath, a diplomat at the German embassy in Paris, on November 7, 1938. I pause to explain what happened and why. Herschel Greenspann's parents, like thousands of Polish-born Jews in Germany, had become naturalized citizens and were stripped of their citizenship by the Nazis in 1933. By 1938, most were destitute, and after the Anschluss, there were even more denaturalized Polish-born Jews in what had become so-called Greater Germany, Germany plus Austria. The Polish government did not want them and forbade their return to Poland. This alarmed the Nazi regime as it planned to repatriate them to Poland. Negotiations opened between Berlin and Warsaw. The Poles did not give in, and in early October, the Polish Interior Minister announced a new ordinance, and it read, "All Polish citizens abroad must present their passports by October 30th to Polish legations to get a special visa giving them the right to return to Poland." Polish Jews living in Greater Germany, however, were not to receive a visa. The German government's response? On October 26, Heinrich Himmler ordered the immediate expulsion of these Jews. Using the full force of the security police and regular police and setting aside other tasks, he admonished, all Polish Jews are to be taken in a group transport and deported without delay over the Polish border. Masses of people, including Herschel Greenspann's mother and father, were held by Polish guards, sometimes for days, in a no-one's land between Poland and Germany. Driven to despair by his parents' plight, Herschel, who was living in Paris, sought, if not revenge, at least a public demonstration of outrage and retaliation, and thus his assassination attempt on November 7. The next day, November 8, German newspapers reported that Greenspan had shot vom Rath and threatened the Jews with reprisals. Attacks began at once on synagogues and Jewish community offices. As ill luck would have it, the Nazi hierarchy was in Munich for the annual commemoration of Hitler's unsuccessful November 1923 putsch, presenting a perfect opportunity for the local party bosses assembled in the city to show their mettle to their Führer. They instructed their organizations at home to destroy synagogues and businesses owned by Jews. The police would not intervene, and those involved would not be arrested. Businesses throughout the district where Robert Rosner's family lived were shattered the night of 9 November. But we didn't realize what was happening generally, Robert recalled. And life goes on, you know. My father, in the morning, went on a business meeting. My father was walking in the midst of the textile district. This is quite close to where the Gestapo was. A car came up and arrested him. But they hadn't come to arrest him, but to arrest the people in that building full of Jewish offices. When they collected the people from the building, there wasn't enough room for my father in the vehicle, so they told my father to get out. Somebody else would collect him. My father came straight home. The Rosner's apartment building, was no more secure than the offices in the textile district. As Robert remembered, they came during the day. We heard the SS coming and arresting people. But we lived on the fourth floor, completely in the back, in a rear courtyard where the poorest people had apartments. There were many arrests on the lower floors. Perhaps they filled their arrest quota before they arrived on the fourth floor. No one in our part of the building was arrested. Still, from this point on, only one question remained: how to get out, where to go. Laura Salheimer, a few years older than Robert, lived in Berlin at the time. She, like other young people, was attending a school to acquire skills useful after emigration from Germany. As she recalled, my parents rang the next evening and said, "Come home." I traveled home to Nuremberg on an express train. I knew enough. I wasn't that stupid that I didn't know something bad had happened. I don't think I realized how bad things were until I got home. My parents were on the platform. My mother was in a sweater and skirt, no makeup, no jewelry, no anything. My father looked awful. We went home. There was an atmosphere of complete gloom and no ornaments, no anything anywhere. The house was in mourning. My parents had had a huge sideboard full of the best china, and the Nazis had taken an axe and smashed the china. They had had a glass display cabinet with a lot of pretty things in it, and also glasses and so on. The Nazis had just taken it and thrown it over. I mean, every little tiny last bit of it was broken. It was like being struck in the head, the feeling of oppression. It was the first time I think I really felt a feeling of oppression and persecution. This was a quantum step. This was the real thing. Laura's father lost his factory. Hilda Rosenthal's father was arrested and sent to a concentration camp. Hilda, 10 years old and living in Frankfurt, was at home with her family the night the synagogue was burned. We were together in the room overlooking the town, and we saw the tremendous flames of the synagogue burning. On the Friday night, they came to take my father to a concentration camp. And because it was a Friday night, and we were Shabbat observant, there was a tremendous discussion for 5 or 10 minutes. Should he carry anything with him? Should he take a suitcase of things? Alfred Delheim, from a poorer family than Laura Salheimer's, nevertheless shared her experience of devastation, and although not so religious as Hilda Rosenthal, lost his father too. Urban and rural, rich and poor, the Jews of Greater Germany suffered the same fate during the November Pogrom. Fred Delheim's family lived in Mutterstadt. He himself worked in Ludwigshafen as a printer's apprentice. On the 10th of November, somehow I was told that in Mutterstadt the synagogue was burning and some houses of Jewish people were demolished. I didn't know what to do. All I wanted was to get home quickly. There was a small train going from Mutterstadt to Ludwigshafen. That train had its station in the middle of Mutterstadt. When I arrived there, my mother and my sister, white as I had never seen them before, were standing there. They told me that the Nazis had taken him with them, and they didn't know where, and the interior of our house had been completely destroyed. We had chickens at home, so we always had 20 or 30 eggs, and they, the Nazis, had thrown all the eggs on the ceiling. Everything was smashed to bits and pieces. All the furniture was demolished. Everything that you can demolish was demolished. But that wasn't the most important thing. The big question was, what had happened to Father? After about a fortnight, we got a card from him, a postcard from the concentration camp Dachau. With the November Pogrom, the plight of Jews in Greater Germany changed radically. For a long while, many had believed that the Nuremberg laws of 1935 conferred stability. Jews would be outcasts, but still tolerated. This myth vanished overnight, literally went up in smoke. The physical demolition of Jews' property, from the destruction of nearly every synagogue to the attacks on businesses owned by Jews, left no place for Jewish religious or economic life in Germany. The imprisonment of Jewish men in concentration camps left no place for Jews at all. Almost overnight, the myth of an apartheid that would allow the Jews their own life with their own cultural institutions exploded. The Nazis and their cooperative countrymen made use of the institutions of the modern state and made use of modern means of communications. Their state-sponsored, centrally organized pogrom against property on November 9 culminated in a state-sponsored, centrally organized action against people on November 10, when 30,000 men were swept out of their homes into concentration camps solely because they were Jews. With their action against people, the men and their families, parents, wives, children, siblings, and with their abandonment of the appearance of old-fashioned mob violence, the Germans crossed a significant threshold. It was perhaps a fine line, but a bright one. Clearly, the regime no longer felt a political need to hide behind the chimera of wanton, mob-driven destruction. Bureaucratic, systematized persecution became open policy, insolent, brazen, arrogant, and visible to all. The party leadership knew its country and was correct in its calculations. The elites did not utter a word. The working class did not utter a word. And thus, it was not the Nazis alone who crossed the line, but their compatriots too. The Germans crossed a significant threshold. Desperation gripped the Jewish community. The sole escape lay in emigration, and all hope for release from concentration camps lay in an exit visa. Safety now meant departure papers. Few thought about learning skills for emigration in the aftermath of the November Pogrom. Emergency overwhelmed planning. With no sense of control, no map or plan, no one knew how best to proceed, and everyone was tense. Stress increased daily. Laura's family argued because of their fear. But her parents agreed unequivocally on one matter. There was no question that my parents wanted me out, me in particular, me out as quickly as possible, out of Germany as quickly as possible. In Britain, newspaper reports describing the violence of the November pogrom prompted public sympathy and government action. The Munich Gestapo ordered all Jews to leave the city in 48 hours and to let the police know by 6 p.m. at what time they would hand over the keys of their dwellings and garages, the Times of London reported on November 11. Misery, terror, and despair, an article following developments in that city observed a few days later. Nearly all the Jewish men had been arrested, and the women were unable to buy food. This morning, the article reported, Jewish women were heard imploring to be served with milk, not for themselves, but for their children. Conditions in Vienna were no better, readers learned. The position of Austria's Jews is becoming daily more precarious, an article of November 14 reported. Although the more violent demonstrations have ceased, the Nazis have prohibited non-Jewish stores, restaurants, and cafes from selling to Jews. As no Jewish shops have been allowed to reopen, the effect has been to reduce many Jews to a position dangerously near starvation. In a powerful speech to the House of Commons, Philip Baker, MP for Derby, mustered the imagination, empathy, and confidence of his colleagues. He detailed the Nazis' antisemitic program of the past 5 years and described the violence of the November pogrom. Where is this going to end? He asked. And he added, what is it going to mean to us before it is ended? Home Secretary Samuel Hoare rose to speak in response. His view of Britain's refugee policy now, after the November pogrom, had shifted. Britain would do more than it had. To mollify potential critics, Hoare hastened to explain that the government's new policy aimed at easing the way for, as they were called, trans migrants, furnishing proof that they would not become a burden on the state. While the absorptive powers of this country might be limited as far as permanent residents are concerned, we certainly could take in larger numbers of refugees for a temporary period, provided they were eventually to be settled in some other part of the world. Adducing credible proof of further emigration within the next 2 years, thousands of German, Austrian, and Czech Jews who had obtained an American quota number valid for immigration in 1940 or 1941 were allowed to move to Britain immediately. Robert Rosner's sister Erna and her husband Hans had got an affidavit from the chicken farming cousin the family had found. While they waited for their quota number to be called, Hans's professor in Vienna arranged a scholarship for him in Manchester. As they had secure prospects to go elsewhere, they now fit the new British entry policies. Other groups were eligible for entry as well. Children under age 17 qualified for a temporary stay. Setting to work straight away after they arrived in December 1938 to make arrangements for the rest of the family, Erna and Hans found a professor there, Professor Littler, who took me as a child, Robert recalled. They also managed to find somebody who took Paula as a maid. Paula left somewhere around February, and I left on a children's transport in April. People between 16 and 35 who were to attend a vocational training program to prepare them for emigration overseas were permitted temporary entry. This provision opened the door to Laura Salheimer. By the middle of December, Laura's uncle, who had emigrated years before, had obtained a student permit for her, which led to a visa to study in England. Persons over 60 with guaranteed support qualified for permanent residence. We were still waiting for my parents, Robert remembered. Will they be able to come? They too needed an entry visa. Hans and Erna rented rooms in a house owned by a working-class woman. She was so much impressed with Hans and Erna that she decided to guarantee for my parents with her life savings of £150. With all the paperwork in order, Erna, Hans, Paula, and Robert grew increasingly anxious for the older Rosners to emigrate. We saw that war was coming. One day, we managed to phone Vienna, which was expensive and very difficult at that time. We managed to get my father on the phone, and he said that he's waiting to get his furniture, which was really their life savings, across. Hans said, "Don't wait. Come." They took his advice. The 9th of November, 1938, was the end of the beginning. The 10th of November was the beginning of the end. We now know that it was the first step toward the Holocaust, but no one, not even the Nazis, knew it then, and the future was not inevitable. The history of the Holocaust could have been a different story. It could have been a history that never happened. Nothing made the Holocaust necessary. There is a signal insight to be gained here. Why commemorate the November Pogrom? Why should we think about it, analyze it, learn about it? In my view, we look to the past to enrich our understanding of the present and to alert us to dangers looming in the future. The November Pogrom warns that the end of the beginning was bad enough. Roundups to concentration camps, forced emigration, desperate division of families. Do we need more to prompt us to act? And glad as we may be for Britain's response, might a nation do more than open its door a crack? The history of the November Pogrom, in short, prompts us to make educated decisions about the steps we should take and when we should take them.